So I'll let you get settled in, and then I'm going to introduce Taro Ayataka and Jessica Schuler. So Taro is the Assistant Director of Conservation for the Westchester County Department of Parks, Recreation, and Conservation. Taro has been surveying the 18,000 acres of county-operated parkland for the past 20 years and has seen many changes to our open spaces in that time. He is an ISA certified arborist, past president of the Connecticut Westchester Ecological Association, and member of the Cold Spring Tree Advisory. He's also, I was going to say expert on beech leaf disease, but as we're learning about it, they're doing some trialing, which is great. And Jessica is the program coordinator for the natural resources, program coordinator for natural resources for the Westchester County Department of Parks and Conservation. Jessica is a horticulturalist and ecological restoration practitioner working to conserve biodiversity and practices sustainable land management across the region. She is also an ISA certified arborist, SER certified ecological restoration practitioner, and serves on several conservation boards and committees such as the SER Mid-Atlantic Chapter and Hudson to Housatonic Regional Conservation Partnership. So, welcome. I'm excited to hear your talk.
All right. So hi, everybody. My name is Taro. Thrilled to be joining you here today. In the after lunch spot, my main job is to make sure everybody keeps awake. So I will try to keep this moving, keep it light. That last part is going to be a challenge, and I'm going to hand that difficult part of leaving this on a high note to my colleague Jessica over there. My job is to get everybody feeling bad about the state of our forests, and Jessica will rebound it. It's a classic movie plot. The hero is the trees. Trees are going to be in danger. Don't worry, Jessica's got the answer. So that's where we're going. And we're going to start with a CEU question. So, fact or fiction, in pre-colonial North America, a squirrel could travel branch to branch from the Atlantic to the Mississippi without touching the ground. Don't answer that, but think about it. So that is something that I've read in, I can't remember where, years ago when I was a beginning naturalist. That was something I had read. And it's not really one of the CEU questions, by the way. So we are going to kind of go over the trends in our Northeast forests for the past 20,000 years in 20 minutes. That is the goal. And along the way, we should come up with the answer to that question. So we're going to start, and actually I heard one of the other speakers mention it. We're going to start with, oops, pre-contact glaciation. So 20,000 years ago, this area here, we would have been looking up at a glacier mile high in some parts. So that Wisconsin glacier 20,000 years ago was nature's whiteboard eraser, kind of scraping all the woody vegetation off of the Northeast. Now, there are things that survived it. They've actually found mosses that have been exposed by receding glaciers that are still photosynthesizing and still alive. But for woody vegetation and for our forests, we were basically starting from scratch after that point. So if you look at the map, and you can see the terminal extent, right where we are here in Long Island, Brooklyn. My wife is from Queens, and when I say she's from Long Island, she gets very mad at me. So 18,000 years ago, the glacier started to recede, and that's going to be the starting point for our forest. That's the birthday, in a way. So the first humans that arrived in this area would have been around 12,000 to 9,000 years ago. Now, the first forests in this area, if you think about it, you have the receding glacier, you're going to have exposed rock. The first woody growth would have been stuff that could transport quickly and rapidly from still vegetated areas. So a lot of windborne species. So birch, alder, things like that are going to be the early tree species. But if you also think about the conditions left behind by that glacier, it's going to be cold, it's going to be wet. So the dominant forest from that period of about I'd say 10,000 years ago, is going to be spruce in most of the Northeast. Now, to time with the arrival of humans to this area, there was a warming trend that was going to allow a warming and drying trend. So oak and pine were going to be the dominant trees from that 9,000 year period. And that coincides with the arrival of the Aboriginal people, the Native Americans, and that's going to be the next major impact on our forests. So one of the traditional silvicultural techniques that Native Americans used is going to be controlled burning, managing their forests through fire. So one of the important food sources for many Native American tribes were acorns and nuts. So to maximize production of those food sources, one of the techniques used was to burn the understory. Now by doing that, our oak trees, our walnuts, our hickories are very fire resistant, at least for the fires that we experience in the Northeast. So in Westchester County, where Jessica and I work, we were able to visit 3 forest fires that occurred this past May, all in the same month. And sure enough, the thick-barked species, the nut-bearing species, survived, no problem, scorched 20, 30 feet up. Things like maples, things like birches, things like cherries did not do nearly as well. So the Native Americans, their silvicultural practice tweaked the forest composition towards those species, oaks and other mass-bearing species. The other thing, just incidentally, the advantage to this type of forest management technique is that for hunting purposes, what we saw in May after a forest fire was lots of new vegetation, would have been attractive to deer for browse, and that would also have, the burn would also allow a wide open alley for spears, for bow and arrow. So it benefited the hunting practices as well as provided the food crop. Now, there is a fantastic document, and I'll provide a link to it later on. So it's a paper by Jonathan Thompson of Smithsonian from 2013, 400 years of change in northeastern forests. So this is going from the 1600s to about 2008. The paper was published in 2013. That document is amazing, and it'll help us understand the changes in the composition of our forests and also where we're going to be going. So with the arrival of Europeans, so 1660, European colonization represented in red, within 100 years, you can see how quickly it spread up until green. Where Europeans came, of course, came their silvicultural practices or their logging. So clear cuts are forests in North America, especially east of the Mississippi, over 90% logged multiple times. So vast forest clearing. That is also going to alter the composition of the forests. Specifically, this paper by Thompson, he was able to look at something called witness trees used by the colonists for their land surveys. So basically, each lot would have a corner tree as a landmark. Those surveyors recorded the species for those trees. So by comparing that data for hundreds of different survey plots from Maine to Pennsylvania, they were able to recreate the forest composition for the 1600s, and then compare it with U.S. Forest Service records for their inventory from 2008 to document the change in forest composition. So some of it is very obvious. So massive declines, chestnut, of course. So for this list of actors, this list of species that were present in that range, chestnut is the only one that is basically functionally extirpated, not gone, just short. Everything else has pretty much, they're all still present, but with massive changes in density and abundance. So, for example, maples went from 17,000 stems to 33,000 stems. The composition broadly for our area becoming more and more maple dominated. On the flip side, you have trees like beech, massive decline from 30,000 to 7,500, so almost more than a 3 times decrease. Beech, hemlock decreased by half. So our late successional tree species in steep decline, our early successional species going way up. Other things that we can see, ashes, This is before emerald ash borer started wiping things out en masse. Ashes remained stable to that point. Birches, slight increase. Cherry, large increase. So we can see the effect of European land management on our forest composition. And this is going to be, it's a little hard for you to see, but the colored dots are going to indicate density of the different species. So beech density drastically decreased, oak density drastically decreased, maple vast increase, and hemlock disappearing. So that's going to take us closer to present day. So that study was up until 2008. Since that time, though, we've experienced a few additional stressors on our forests. So, by the way, this is going to help with that CEU question about the squirrel going from coast to coast. So, sorry, from coast to river. Our forests have rebounded to the point where now they are about 80% or so of what they used to be at their max. So a squirrel could feasibly go from Massachusetts to Ohio, not too bad from branch to branch. So some of the threats facing our forests currently, beech leaf disease. So this is something that we are extremely concerned with in Westchester County. We discovered it in Westchester in 2019, and the first observation we made, Jessica and I, were along the Bronx River Parkway, and we saw beech leaves with this dark banding, interveinal banding. So it looks somewhat similar to this. It wasn't as bad. At the time, we did some research. We found that beech leaf disease was present in Ohio, but there were no records basically from Chautauqua County to where we are. Somehow it jumped, and sure enough, that is our culprit. So within 2 to 3 years, basically, we're losing all the foliage on many of our beech trees. So these scrawny, naked-looking stems, that is a May photograph. So leaf out early May, by end of May, leaves gone from the trees. Beeches form some of our densest deciduous forest stands. So what's happening is all of a sudden you're getting daylight to the forest floor. You can see those patches of sunlight there. And unfortunately, in our area, with a lot of stressors and a lot of invaders, what we're anticipating is the understory of our forest filling with things like barberry, euonymus, bittersweet, all the things we don't really want. So beech leaf disease has about a 10 to 15% mortality in Ohio after 10 years. We are experiencing symptoms progressing a little bit faster. So we're planning for the worst. And so Jess may tell you a little bit about some of the mitigating efforts that we're trying to do. And you can just see beech density across our region. The darker the color, the more beech trees. This is 2021 beech leaf disease observations on iNaturalist. So you can see it jumped from Cleveland and Chautauqua all the way to us. And then by 2023, you can see it's kind of covered the eastern seaboard in New England. It's going to be really bad when it hits the Adirondacks if it continues that same trajectory of tree decline. Emerald ash borer, everybody should be familiar with, so I'm not going to spend much time on it. But in Westchester, within the past 5 years, we've lost almost all our ash trees in northern Westchester. Just in case you're not familiar with the symptoms, so typical compound ash leaf. This is the characteristic exit hole that the adult beetle makes when it leaves the tree. The larvae feed underneath the bark in a zigzag pattern, functionally girdling the tree, causing the crown to die back and the tree to die. This is where we are in Westchester at this point. A lot of our most damaging recent storms, where there are power outages, I've seen it firsthand. It's usually an ash tree lying across the power lines, so it's going to have a major effect on our budget for tree removal at a minimum. And this is emerald ash borer observations. Ohio, East Coast, it's just about everywhere at this point. And this is one of the ones that I'm most concerned with, although there's the least data to back up my concerns. So Asian jumping worm. Hopefully not everybody is familiar with it, but in Westchester, we find these with every log we roll over, with every stone we overturn. we find the jumping worms. So if you haven't seen it before, I will show you a video. If you have a weak stomach, especially after eating lunch, you may not want to watch. They're kind of gross. So that's how they get their name. They are vigorous. They can get to be about 10 inches long. They will do backflips in your hand if you try to pick them up, and they are voracious eaters. So this is something that we're seeing more and more on our trails, more and more even off trail. So if you encounter soil that looks like cooked ground beef, just kind of crumbly on the surface, that is worm castings. So worms had a really good PR agent at some point. Most people still associate worms with healthy soil. Worms do not belong in our northeast forests. Think about the glacier would have eradicated any worms that would have been here, although that's even doubtful that they were here prior to the glacier. So our forest leaf litter is supposed to decompose over several years by fungal and bacterial action. All right, so healthy duff layer, you're going to have whole intact leaves on top, getting crumblier until they're just humus at the bottom. With the worms, those leaves are turned over within 1 year. So that release of nutrients, it causes accelerated leaching. Plants cannot take up the nutrients released by decomposition effectively. And so what you're getting is excess nitrogen and phosphorus hitting the bedrock below and leaching downhill. That combined with the crumbly texture of the soil on top, following a rain event, you're going to have erosion. All that stuff is going to end up in our streams and waterways, causing anoxia, eutrophication. So worms are going to have a major impact. The other thing that worms are doing is, for our native plants, that the seeds are used to germinating in a moist, shaded environment. Now all of a sudden, they're on top of the soil. They're going to be exposed to drying conditions, higher temperatures. There may also be, and I suspect there are going to be impacts on soil fungi, mycorrhizal fungi, where I mushroom, and I've been doing it for 20 years in our area. Where there are worms, I don't even bother anymore. So there's going to be disturbance to the mycorrhizal networks, and we know the importance of that on tree health. Sorry, that was reverse. Deer are a major factor in Westchester County as well. So we know that anything under 6 feet is pretty much fair game in Westchester County. Sometimes deer will stand on their hind legs, and that gets to be even higher than 6 feet. So deer population is not at its all-time high. It is close to it, but deer were basically extirpated from New York in the early 1900s. So it hit the nadir around 1910 or so. Subsequently, they've had a huge rebound with massive effects on our forest composition as well. So not all tree seedlings are favored equally by deer, so they are going to select against things like oak. They'll eat the acorns, they'll eat the young trees. And they're going to let things like suckering beech get by, things like cherry get by. And so more and more of our forests, we're just seeing that small handful of tree species, if anything at all, regenerate. This is deer abundance spread from 1950 to 2000. So this is the southeast, but it's pretty similar to northeast results. So deer sparse, deer concentrated, deer running amok at the end. Locally, this is Connecticut, so over 15 years or so, some fluctuations in deer population, but the overall level is extremely high, resulting in a lack of tree regeneration in the forests. And then the last one I'll cover, and perhaps the biggest threat to our forests, is climate change. So there is an amazing resource that I have linked here, and I can make it available at the end of this. So it's the NOAA Climate Change Atlas. And if you haven't checked out that tool, you should. It's absolutely amazing. You can enter your latitude and longitude, and within that 1 degree, it will tell you the forecast for all the species in your area. So it starts, and I'm sorry, this is a little bit small, but it lists them in abundance, so relative abundance. So red maple is our most common species, tree species in this area, and it's going to go down the list. After that, it basically shows 2 climate change models and predicts how each species is going to do under those climate conditions. Then it will tell you how they are going to react to both biotic and abiotic factors. So biotic factors, pathogens, pests, insects, things like that. Abiotic, drought, extreme temperatures, flooding. Taking all those factors together, it's going to make a prediction on how each species will do going forwards with climate change. And the results are kind of scary. So, because it's so small, I kind of highlighted it for you. So Amelanchier is expected to have major losses in our forests. That should have impacts on how people plant their backyards as well. All our birches, or just about all our birches, black, paper, river, yellow is not listed, but that is another one, not forecasted to do well going forwards. Spruce is the same. Surprisingly, pin oak, not going to do well. Black willow, and there are more. There are going to be big increases in some of our more common tree species. So, northern red, white chestnut oak, sugar maple, tulip tree, eastern red cedar. Things that are not doing poorly already are going to do even better. Net result might be a loss of diversity in our forests. The other really interesting thing too, and this kind of came up in one of the other speakers' talks, is they predict which species are going to infill into our forests or migrate into our forests. So infill might be trees that are represented in a very small percentage, things like box elder and silver maple. We're going to see increases in those perhaps. We may also see the arrival of things like shortleaf and loblolly pine in our areas going forward. There's some exciting ones too. Persimmon could be a good tree to plant, but it's a fascinating document, and you can look at it for your exact area. So that is what we're facing. We're facing declines in diversity. We're facing challenges from pests and pathogens, and we're looking forward to perhaps new and novel forests. So how do we deal with that when we're managing 18,000 acres of parkland? That is what Jessica will explain.
Thank you. Oh wow, this is really foolproof. It's just one big green button. Hi. So, what do we do? And I did try to run through this. I have to say, Taro made me feel very old this week because I had to learn this new program, Prezi. So we're not in PowerPoint. Okay, so the future. So what does the future mean? We are tackling everything that's coming at us through lots of different avenues. And that's what I'm going to cover. The first is taking a regional approach. And we've talked a lot about ecoregions and ecotypes. I've heard some people mentioning that. But the reality is that nature, climate change, everything that we manage doesn't have political boundaries, right? And whether it's public or private lands, there are no boundaries. So we all have to collaborate and work together and work regionally. And that's what we are attempting to do, despite we are a government agency. But we're working together in partnership. And so everything we do, every decision we make matters. With you individually, with your specific plots of land or your gardens that you design and manage, everything is connected. So just take one species, for example, chestnut oak. This is a distribution of chestnut oak in the eastern seaboard. These are observations of the little hair streak butterfly that needs the chestnut oak to reproduce and survive. And these are all the living organisms that could potentially eat, or some of the living organisms that could potentially eat that hair streak. So our plants and our planting and our landscapes are interconnected, and they form ecosystems in themselves. And traditionally, we have lots of different options. We spend tons of time picking out the individual plants that we put into our landscapes. And I think Jay brought this up too. He said, you know, I think about bloom sequence, I think about structure, but then how do I pull into Ian's knowledge of the horticulture industry and what plants are available or not? So what is adding in some of these different ecological functions into our design process? We can balance them both out and have a greater impact for the long term. And that's what we need to do to scale up the resilience and restoration work that we are bringing to our landscapes. So don't think of it as a beautiful garden, thinking of it as, you know, one leaf, one plant, a whole ecosystem interconnected across the landscape. And that's just how our watersheds are too, right? Our trees are rivers to the sky. That's what our regional forester with the New York State DEC, George Profis, always says when he talks. Is wonderful, right? Each leaf plays a role in bringing the water that we all drink here in New York City across the watershed landscape. So we have to understand resiliency, and what does that mean exactly? We are trying to find things in our beech forests that are naturally regenerating, same with our ash forests, and trying to do what it is we can to protect them and allow them to thrive. We are well aware of what happens when we plant monocultures, right, across our urban forests. So even though Taro and I manage lots of forested land, we also manage lots of cultivated parkland, as well as connect with municipalities who manage tremendous urban forests, right? And we all know the story of what happened when we lined our American streets with American elms, and then they all disappeared, right? After Dutch elm disease came on through. And we learned it again with ashes, right? And so we are looking for natural resilience. There are organizations, there's a group looking for genetic diversity of surviving ash trees and trying to save that so the species don't go extinct. But we also have to be smart in how we're managing things. And I'm really happy and excited to say that we are actually hiring an urban forester for Westchester County. So if you know anybody interested in working with us and joining our team, that's my little plug. Please let us know. And it's diversifying what we're planting is ultimately important. There was a study recently, I think it was published last year from the Yale School of Forestry, that talked about our urban forests and what the recommendations are. So back in the 80s, they came up with recommendations that 10%, let's see if I get this right, 10% of one species, you should plant no more than 10% of one species, 20% of one genus, and 30% of one family in your urban forest or your plot of land that you're managing. You have to diversify it. And realistically, in practice, that hasn't been implemented anywhere. And so what is the problem? Why can't we connect those dots if we have these standards or recommendations? A piece of it is our nursery supply chain and what is currently available and what isn't, right? So Ian talked a lot about our nursery trade. And Uli's going to close out and talk a lot more about our nursery trade and what's happening. But what we are trying to do in Westchester is develop a hyper-local seed supply network and native plant network, where we start with growing, collecting seed from the wild, ethically, responsibly using seeds of success, then growing it out, some of which will be grown out in seed increase plots. We have a facility, Hilltop Hanover Farm, that has 35 seed increase plots right now of different species, and then growing them out and getting them back into our restoration projects, into our gardens, and into our landscapes. So restoration is that process of which we are assisting the recovery of an ecosystem that has been degraded, damaged, and destroyed, and essentially everywhere we work, it has been. So it gives us a little bit of hope. It gives us guidance on what it is we are doing. And I just wanted to give Leslie Jones Sawyer, former principal of Andrew Pogon and Associates, the plug that the title of our talk was not ours. I just thought it was too appropriate not to pass up. So she, gets that plug. And so restoration itself is on a restorative continuum, right? And so the efforts and the goals that we set are defined by the resources we have and essentially what we want to accomplish in the end. And restoration isn't turning back in time, it's shifting a trajectory forward. It's all forward moving. And we are facing unprecedented change. We are facing an era in which novel relationships are happening and we are seeing things. I know just in my lifetime I've seen tremendous change in our landscapes. But there are things that we can do to guide and shift the trajectory in a forward motion and reach a more positive, resilient, ultimate landscape. And our colleagues in the New York City Parks Department have a tremendous amount of experience. They've been doing ecological restoration work since the 1970s. They have partnered with their newer nonprofit partner, the Natural Areas Conservancy, and they've developed great tools that anybody working in this region could use and you can access online. This first one is called the First Two tool, the Forest Identification and Restoration Selection Tool. You can access it online. It's on their website, mobile adaptive, fantastic. You can literally use it and key out what type of forest you're standing in when you're out in the field, or you can choose a restoration planting plan based on just forest names or characteristics, or just on general forest conditions. The really neat thing with this tool is that they married it with the Climate Tree Atlas that Taro mentioned, and so they have recommendations based on what the Climate Tree Atlas is saying for our area too, and what we should and shouldn't be planting. They also, to pair it, they have this wonderful native species planting guide, also available free as a PDF, recommending species that are plant community based. However, they also focus on horticultural conditions. So pulling in the plant community information into what we look at as a sunny dry spot or a wet shady spot, so on and so forth. It's a great resource, definitely useful in the tri-state area and even beyond. So research. We collaborate a lot with researchers. Most recently, we've partnered with the New York State Hemlock Initiative, where we're monitoring for hemlock woolly adelgid and also their biocontrols, mostly through our partnership with Lower Hudson PRISM, which is the Partnership for Regional Invasive Species Management in New York. We are working with the U.S. Forest Service. The U.S. Forest Service is using traditional silviculture techniques and bringing them to the urban environment or suburban environment, in Tara in my case. And one fun project that we've developed with them, oops, I was supposed to have our, oh no, I don't have the picture of our, sorry, our oak orchard. We installed an oak orchard with the U.S. Forest Service at Lasden Park and Arboretum, which is in Katona, where I'm based. And so what the U.S. Forest Service is looking to do is they are studying ecotypes of two species of oak trees, chestnut oak and white oak, on a gradient from Baltimore all the way up to Springfield, Massachusetts. So in 2021, we all went out and collected acorns from our various ecotypes. Forest Service grew them out, and then we planted them this season in both canopy gaps. So primarily in Westchester, we were planting in beech gaps. And then we also have a couple of orchards, oak orchards. So at Lasden, we planted 1,200 baby oak trees that will someday be a seed source for our nursery and restoration work. But essentially, the foresters are curious to see how different ecotypes are going to be successful or not across that gradient from Baltimore to Springfield, Massachusetts. We have natural resistance biocontrol that has occurred that we don't have any control over. So this is one of the two fungi that are actually killing spotted lanternfly. So that is happening, and people at Cornell are studying it. And we work very closely too with the American Chestnut Foundation. This was the first project at Lasden, that we were very closely engaged with. We actually have 2 chestnut orchards in which researchers are studying both the GMOs and the back crosses. And there is one other technique that we don't primarily use at Lasden that is being used for chestnut research, is looking at the viruses that actually feed on the fungus of the chestnut blight, or hypovirulence. But ultimately, everything that I just mentioned and additional collaborations is what we have now, right? So scaling up means no one person, no one organization can come up with the answers. We all have to collaborate and work together. And so it has just sort of happened organically that our local 59 plant network conversations were happening the same time the Northeast Seed Network was forming. And so it is a wonderful partnership that our little Ecoregion 59 fits nicely into the entire Northeast. And you're going to hear more about that from Uli after us. But it's incredibly large region, and it's been a fun exercise hearing about what they are coming up with and what we want to prioritize across the whole region versus more locally what we need here in Ecoregion 59 and Westchester, New York City, and Fairfield County. And if anybody's up for a little trip, we are hosting an open house actually next week at Hilltop Hanover Farm. This is our area's headquarters for our local 59 plant network, so we can see the seed increase plots, do some cleaning, talk about your species needs, and how we can move forward to get everything that you need for your projects into the supply chain and growing. For more than a decade now, we've been working very closely with what's called EMA, the Environmental Monitoring and Management Alliance of the Hudson Valley. It runs all the way from the south, from the New York Botanical Gardens, Thame Family Forest, up to the Hike Preserve just south of Albany. And we are focusing on long-term management that then drives and informs conservation efforts. And we have priorities in which we are looking at climate change. Particularly, we're monitoring phenology over the long term. There was a neat paper that came out of this group that looked at both our phenology data and the data that was collected back in the 1800s from the New York State Regents students. And actually, in talking about the phenology shifts from earlier flowering flowers, there is about a month difference now from in our spring ephemerals flowering earlier. And we also are working on, so a lot of the deer management that we're doing is all in partnership in this whole region. We're all doing the same data collection and discussions and working together across the region. Not just individual preserves having management plans, but working together. Again, we do this with Lower Hudson Partnership for Regional Invasive Species Management too. We have primarily in the last 2 years, Taro has been working very closely with this Beach Leaf Disease Coalition that was based out of Teatown Lake Reservation. And we have recommendations on what you should be doing to monitor the health of your beech trees, the status of the infection, and also what you should be doing in terms of restoration. And so some of the things that we have been doing is actively tubing trees that are regenerating underneath beech groves to protect them from deer and to make sure we have the future of the forest coming up. We've also been doing some plantings, like in the U.S. Forest Service project, and also putting up tension fencing in bigger beech groves in partnership with Westchester Land Trust to try to protect the future of the forest and allow for regeneration. Because again, if our canopy trees go away, we don't have that understory layer in Westchester County because we have too many deer. And so that is a big part These are the vines that we are up against, and I'm sure you see that in the city and elsewhere. Planting Westchester, we have worked with about 100 volunteers to pull together information on 9 topic areas around planting, growing food, doing restoration work, and protecting and planting more trees. Most recently, we're developing a community garden network across the county. We have at least 80 community and school gardens in Westchester County that we're trying to get information and connect them all together. Building a local Westchester County tree nursery, which is what we're going to be designing in 2024, and hopefully building either towards the end of next year or the beginning of 2025 to be able to supply trees, native plants, to anybody who is partnering with us, municipalities, to plant and restore local biodiversity. Toshi already mentioned this, but we have just started a pilot with Perfect Earth Project, really focusing on our landscape practices with the hopes that we can be successful in the next couple of years together and then branch out into municipalities, additional facilities within the Parks Department. We have over 50 facilities. There are 6 of us that have signed on to work with Perfect Earth this year. And so we hope that by communicating and working together and training our staff, all of Westchester County Parks and our partners will be working in more healthy and ecologically nature-based land care in the future. And they just highlighted us in a Gardenista article, which talks about the seed increase program at Hilltop Hanover Farm. More recently, I've gotten involved with Hudson and Housatonic, which I find super fun, thinking about that landscape scale of management and restoration. Throughout the United States, we have regional conservation partnerships, or RCPs. So if you don't know what your local RCP is, I recommend Googling RCPs today and figuring that out, because there actually is quite a bit of funding now available through them to do more work. We have one partner in the Hudson to Housatonic partnership, Aspatuck Land Trust, who's doing tremendous work in terms of green corridor work, nature-based solutions, and using native plants in home gardens and school gardens, and it's really incredible. So we are all collaboratively working together to increase conservation efforts in both public and private lands together. And lastly, in the last 2 decades, right, the technology, and I also think the sense of urgency that everybody is feeling, participatory science has grown, and it is an incredible way to engage the larger public in our efforts of knowledge, understanding what it is we are doing, and how we can inform our management. And so working, whether it's monitoring phenology and interacting directly with individual plants every week, or documenting an up-and-coming invasive species through IMAP invasives, or just clicking a cool picture of a nice bird and posting it on iNaturalist. All of it is super important, and engaging youth has been really rewarding in this type of work. And so it's usually when they start monitoring, they're collecting the data, they're understanding the initiative, they then take action, and they really take ownership of the project as a whole. So public participation in science is really key. This was a student using IMAP invasives and the Lower Hudson Prism Blockbuster survey to document up-and-coming invasive species in the region. So that's a lot of things we are doing and we can do, but we know that the disturbance is going to continue, right? And we're going to have those new trajectories coming at us. So the disturbance is going to be those big windstorms, it's going to be the rain, it's going to be the droughts. We are going to see the arrival of new pests and diseases. From Taro's presentation, we're going to see the return of some other forest trees, but we really are going to see more activism and more awareness. I don't know if you all see it, but I definitely see it that younger school kids and generations are more engaged today now than they were 20 years ago. And we can make a difference. This is a Girl Scout using a spotted lanternfly vacuum in one of our parks this summer, right? And literally the Local 59 Native Plant Network wouldn't have gotten its start if it weren't for the incredible volunteers that worked throughout COVID to grow, clean, and cultivate and care for the seeds and the plants that they have grown. And really the future is bright, so it's up to us, right, to work with organizations like Bronx is Blooming, like Perfect Earth, to develop and train the next generation, and then also to develop the hiring and the jobs for them to come into the work, the essential work that we're going to have to do going forward and grow. So think about your individual patch, your project, your garden, but it's not isolated, right? It's all across the landscape. We have a greater mosaic patchwork across the landscape, and we all have to pitch in to this greater vision of sustainable, holistic land management. So thank you. Sure. Any questions? We answered all your questions.
Can you hear me?
Okay.
At first I was going to ask, Tara, when you were speaking at first, it looked like the number of oaks in that first graphic that you showed with like what was here at this time and what is here now in the modern world, it showed that the oaks had also declined. So I was thinking, okay, so does that mean that we should plant a higher percentage of oaks because the oaks have declined? And now then the second part, you were talking about the fact that the oaks are going to do better. So does that mean that we should plant more amelanchiers because the oaks are going to do better? Or are the oaks going to go back to I know you guys probably don't know the answer, but like, or are the oaks going to go back to where they were before they declined during the modern practices that made them decline? And then paired with that is like, if the prior practices were the Native American practices where they were burning and creating different forests than would have been there if they weren't there, then what's the best forest that we actually want? Because there are like 4 different versions, and how do we support that with when we're planting?
Sure, great question. So yes, the Climate Change Atlas did predict that a few of the oak species are going to do well. Now, one of the reasons they might do well is oaks require a lot of sunlight. With our current forests, they are very dense and maple dominated. Maples produce a lot of shade. So if we get things like beech dieback, which looks like it's going to happen, oaks are a candidate species to underplant. They might be the ones that regenerate, but it also probably will require additional management to make sure they are not outcompeted by things like ailanthus or other unwanted species. So there's potential for oaks with disturbance. We are experiencing more wildfires. Like I said, we had 3 this past May in just Westchester. Oaks may do well in that kind of habit or environment as well. So the other thing I should mention too about the Climate Change Atlas, it is updated periodically. An early version showed sugar maple declining steeply. The latest version shows it doing well. So nothing is written in stone. It's all in flux. But this is kind of the best modeling that they can do at this point. Things like amelanchier and its future going forward might be a little more complicated. So the amelanchiers we're seeing a lot of rust damage, for example, on an annual basis. They're just struggling. The birches as well. So with the droughts we're experiencing, a lot of the river birch that I've seen in wild conditions dropping leaves in August and September. So their long-term prognosis may not be good under this current climate trajectory. Yeah, so I mean, for sure. So I would say if you're designing a landscape for a client, you might want to not use some of those species because, but they play an important role. So I mean, especially when looking at beach stands again. So it's a mast-bearing species. We want to replace them with something equivalent or that can serve that same ecological function. So hickories, oaks, other mast-bearing species. If you have a client that wants to feed cedar waxwings in the fall, you know, use a fruit-bearing species, but maybe not amelanchier. Save the amelanchier for your backyard that you're going to let go wild, perhaps.
Yeah, so if you can hear that they're, yeah, the chestnuts, the question is, are we going to be replanting chestnuts? So the American Chestnut Foundation does have the back crosses available, and they've been, so a little bit of Chinese chestnut in the American chestnut. The GMOs that were developed from SUNY ESF, it was actually a year ago, the public comment period opened up to see if they could go about releasing that, and I haven't heard an update since then. So we're sort of waiting on the USDA to allow for the release of them.
So one really interesting thing too from the Thompson 400-year change thing. So along with that squirrel tall tale, there is kind of this idea that chestnuts comprised a large percent of our forests pre-contact, and from the data that they collected, it represented like less than 5% of our forests. That said, for restoration, having chestnuts in the palette would be absolutely amazing. That would just be a fantastic addition. So that was one of the old friends that we're going to hope is going to come back.
So I'm really impressed with your knowledge and what you're doing at the county level, because it's a government organization, not a not-for-profit or a botanical garden or a private organization. And I was just wondering if other counties up and down New York are working at the same level as you are.
Not sure. I have met some foresters from other municipalities, and I was very impressed with the work they're doing, so I'm sure there's lots of good people out there. We have more opportunities to do this kind of work just because we're facing so many challenges down in Westchester. So every invasive species that seems to arrive in the region seems to hit Westchester early on. So that's why we are ahead of the game in responding to beech leaf disease. We're trying to create models that can be replicated elsewhere as the disease progresses. And also having Jessica with the department for the last few years, she's been a tireless advocate for getting that forester position hired, for really hiring good people. So I think so much of it just depends on getting those keystone players like Jessica.
Refund, yes. We're trying to get to the point where we could be a little more proactive and not reactive.
Hi, thank you guys for such a comprehensive presentation. I was actually hoping we could just quickly circle back to the part about RCPs. I just didn't quite follow. Jessica, maybe you could explain that a little bit more.
Yeah, so it is regional conservation partnerships that are federally funded, and then they can also go out for additional funding support from states and even private funding opportunities. And they just bring nonprofits, landowners, agencies together for a specific region and adopt goals and objectives and working together across a larger region. So ours here in I don't know if Hudson Housatonic comes to Long Island. I don't think it does, but at least Manhattan and the Bronx, I think, are considered part of Hudson to Housatonic. But yeah, it's really an amazing group. I just attended our gathering for the entire Northeast in Amherst a couple weeks ago, and it's fantastic learning about what everybody across a region can accomplish together.